In today's NBA, there always seems to be this desire to compare today's game to days of the past and how certain players of the past would fare in today's game or vice versa, which teams would dominate in prior eras or potentially teams that were dominant in their respective eras but maybe not be as successful in present day. To be honest, I personally think it's one of the more pointless debates in basketball because every era of basketball was based on a different style of play at a given time. But more importantly, at the end of the day, we will never know whether a guy like Wilt Chamberlain would have been as dominant in today's NBA, or if Andre Drummond had played in the 80s, that he would have been the best player or one of the best big men in the league. And of course, whether the Bulls of the 90s would have been as dominant against the likes of teams that we see today. At the end of the day, these debates and arguments will never truly be solved because there are so many factors and circumstances that simply cannot be accounted for. But all that being said, we're going to indulge in one of these debates today, and it's the debate that has recently been brought back to light because of a comment made by Steph Curry that he would take the 2017 Warriors over the 96 Bulls in a 7-game series. So in today's video, we're going to assess in detail which team would have actually won in a 7-game series between the Kevin Durant era Warriors and the 72-10 Chicago Bulls, and why Steph Curry is out of his mind thinking his team would win in 6 games. So what's going on, everyone? You are listening to Bull Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Now, when I initially saw this statement come out from Steph that the KD era Warriors would beat the Bulls in 6 games if they were to match up, stating that if you looked at the team on paper, he liked their chances and that they would win in 6, my reaction was basically this. But after I had a good laugh, I thought, well, let's try and assess how these two teams compare and try to do so as objectively as possible, which of course, as a Bulls fan, is incredibly hard to do. There's always going to be some semblance of bias, but I will try my best to be as objective as possible in this analysis. So let's start with the 96 Bulls, who obviously went on to win 72 games for a regular season record at the time and ultimately won the championship, making it their 4th title in the 90s, which it's funny that Steph and KD and their era Bulls would beat the 96 Bulls and not the Warriors team that went 73-9, but of course blew a 3-1 lead and lost in the finals, which is why that team will never be recognized as the best team in NBA history over the Bulls, given they couldn't win a championship. But starting with that 96 Bulls team, you had the greatest player of all time in Michael Jordan, one of the greatest defenders of all time in Scottie Pippen, another elite defender and rebounder in Dennis Rodman, a dynamic scorer and passer off the bench in Tony Kukoc, and a great and underrated point guard in Ron Harper, and of course the Australian big man in Luke Longley, who I always thought was a bit underrated for his role as well on that Bulls team. You also had key role players and shooters in Steve Kerr and Judd Bushler, Jason Caffey, Dickie Simpkins, Bill Wennington, etc. For the Warriors, you obviously had the big 4 of Kevin Durant, Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, and Draymond Green. You had role players like Andre Iguodala, Sean Livingston, JaVale McGee, David West, Zaza Pachulia was actually the main starting center for that team. And then there were some other rotational players, but really that team didn't have a lot of depth outside of that big 4, which you really don't need a ton of depth when you have those 4 guys. Now, let me just state from the outset, when looking at the matchups anyway for the starting lineup, let's start there. Who would be the better player between each of these matchups? And then we'll assess in more detail how the teams would actually go against each other despite head-to-head battles in the starting 5. So at point guard, I think we can all agree Steph Curry has the advantage over Ron Harper, and it's probably not even close. As much as I like Ron Harper and think he was a very underrated player in the second three-peat, Curry is the greatest shooter of all time and arguably a top 10 player of all time with his accomplishments and accolades. That being said, I do think Harper would and could give Curry a lot of problems on the defensive end just because he was such a good defender and was bigger and a stronger point guard, especially for that time. At shooting guard, obviously, Michael Jordan over Klay Thompson. I don't even have to explain why. Now, at small forward, I know technically Kevin Durant is a power forward on the Nets now, but on the Warriors, he was their small forward while Draymond Green played the 4 spot. And between Kevin Durant and Scottie Pippen, you'd have to take Kevin Durant for how great Pippen was as a player. Kevin Durant is a generational talent, arguably another top 10 player of all time. I do think this matchup would be very interesting, though, which I'll discuss more in a little bit. At power forward, my God, seeing Rodman and Draymond going head to head would be box office for TV ratings. As I'm kind of going through these, I almost wish that we somehow in some alternate universe could see these two teams go at each other in their primes. Seeing these two hotheads and guys like that trying to get under their opponent's skins in Draymond and Rodman would be must-see TV every night. But if I had to choose who is better over the other, this is probably the hardest one in determining who is better, whereas the others are much more straightforward. But I'm going to go with Rodman just because he was so gifted with his rebounding ability and elite defense. Obviously, Draymond is another elite defender, and he's a better playmaker than Rodman was. Also, just a better scorer than Rodman was, at least in 1996 anyway. But I'm giving Rodman the edge over Draymond Green. And then finally, at center, I mean, Luke Longley was never really known to be a great big man, but comparing him to Zaza, yeah, I'm taking Longley, a better scorer, rebounder, and shot blocker than Zaza was. At least Zaza at the time of 2017 when he was already starting to decline. So that gives the Bulls a 3-2 advantage over the Warriors in just position by position matchups. Looking at the depth charts, I think Kukoc is the best guy coming off the bench between both teams. As great as Iguodala was, he was starting to regress by 2017 and wasn't as great of a scorer as Kukoc was, albeit being a better defender. And as I mentioned before, the Warriors team in 2017 didn't have a ton of depth off of their bench, mainly because they couldn't afford to bring depth pieces with how much money they had locked up in playing for the Big Four. Whereas the Bulls had shooters off the bench, guys like Steve Kerr, Judd Buechler, bigger and more physical players in Jason Caffey, Dickie Simpkins, and Bill Wennington. Now let's look at this schematically, because you can't just do a like-for-like comparison by position. Obviously, the biggest question mark in this whole thing for the Bulls that leads a lot of people to say that the Warriors would beat the Bulls is that they were one of the most elite offensive teams the NBA has ever seen. And really the key difference being their elite three-point shooting, which the Bulls did not have because no team in the NBA in the 90s shot the three ball at a rate that you'd see today. That just wasn't how the game was played. I mean, to put it into perspective, the Bulls shot an average of 16.5 threes a game in 1996, which was ranked 15th in the league, whereas the Warriors averaged 31.2 three-pointers per game in 2017, nearly double the number of attempts than the 96 Bulls were shooting. That being said, though, the Bulls were actually more efficient shooting from deep than the Warriors were, shooting 40.3% from three, whereas the Warriors shot 38.3% from three. And that's because the Bulls in 96 were one of the best three-point shooting teams in the league by percentage, third in the league to be exact, because they had none other than the Warriors head coach and Steve Kerr, who shot threes at a 51% clip that season. Judd Buechler, who shot over 44%, and Kukoc, who shot 40% from three. Not only that, but MJ was MJ, and he also shot 43% from three that season as well. Granted, this is all on way fewer attempts than what you would see in today's game, but the point is these guys were more than capable of shooting threes at an efficient rate, contrary to popular opinion that the Bulls wouldn't be able to outlast in today's NBA's outside shooting. They had great shooters on the team that if they were required to take more threes, they would have been able to knock them down. That just wasn't how the game was played in their time. Now, the other area of concern or question mark for the Bulls is how would they be able to contain the Warriors' elite scoring and outside shooting, especially as it relates to Steph Curry? Would their perimeter defense be able to hold up against the likes of KD, Curry, and Thompson? Well, I think it's important to note that the Bulls were one of the best perimeter defensive teams in the league in 1996. They were top 5 in the league in opponents' three-point shooting as well as mid-range jumpers, and they were number 1 in the league by defensive rating overall. They also had the best offensive rating as well, and 4th in the league in turnover rate for their opponents. So despite the fact that most people remember the 90s Bulls of being an elite scoring team just simply by the fact that they had Jordan, well, they were also one of the best defensive teams in the league at that time as well. That being said, though, the Warriors were also number 1 in the league in offensive rating and number 2 in defensive rating in 2017. And I think the biggest difference that would give them an advantage over the Bulls is the fact that the Warriors played with much better pace than the Bulls did. The Warriors were 4th in the league in pace, whereas the Bulls were 20th in 96. The Warriors were a young, fast-running, high-octane team, while the Bulls, elite on both ends of the floor in the half-court in 96, were not as great in transition. They were older. They were an older team than the Warriors were in 17 anyway. The Bulls' starting lineup, with the exception of Longley, they were all in their 30s, while the Warriors' Big Four were all in their 20s in the peak of their primes. So, Would the Bulls have been able to keep up with the pace and speed for which the Warriors played? To me, that would be really the biggest factor for which the Warriors could take out the Bulls in a 7-game series simply because of their youth and fast-paced approach towards the game. That being said though, when it comes to pace, because of the Bulls' defense, they're one of the best in the NBA in slowing teams down that like to operate in transition. The Bulls were known to control the tempo of their games and manage the flow of offense. Now, I'm not saying they would have been able to do that as well as they did against teams in the 90s as they would against, say, the 2017 Warriors, but there is something to be said about their ability to disrupt the flow of offense for which the Warriors like to play. At the same time, though, the advantage the Warriors have over the Bulls is the fact that they had 3 elite scorers, 2 of which are some of the best scorers in NBA history in Steph Curry and Kevin Durant, whereas the Bulls really just had 1 elite scorer in Michael Jordan. Yes, Scottie Pippen was a great scorer as well, but he wouldn't be able to put up the same kind of scoring output as someone like Steph Curry or Kevin Durant. The other factor is that for the Bulls, their primary scorer, Michael Jordan, of course, the Warriors would have one of their better defenders in Klay Thompson on him, and you'd have to think that Steve Kerr, which would be weird given he's coaching one team and playing for the other, but you'd have to think that the Warriors are going to have Draymond switch on Michael Jordan on defense since Rodman wouldn't be as much of a scoring threat. Like any team that went against Michael Jordan during that time period, you always had to ensure your best defender or even defenders were on him. You had to double team him, even triple team him at all costs. You always needed your best defenders on him if you didn't want Jordan to drop 50 on you on a nightly basis, which he did regularly anyway. All that being said though, it's still Michael Jordan, and we all know the guy had a killer instinct and wanted to win at all costs no matter who was defending him. The other thing that's worth noting is that because the Bulls had Dennis Rodman, this enabled them to be one of the best offensive rebounding teams in the league, averaging 15 offensive rebounds per game, which is insane. You would never see something like that in today's NBA. While the Warriors, although were a strong rebounding team in 2017 overall, they were 20th in the league in offensive rebounds, averaging 9 offensive rebounds per game. Now, you could say, well, that's because they were just so efficient on offense and didn't miss that many shots, which is true, but they did not have a strong interior presence for offensive boards, with Zaza Pachulia and Draymond Green being smaller for the power forward position. So Rodman, because of his elite rebounding ability, especially on offense, would give the Bulls more second chance opportunities even if they didn't have as many scores as the Warriors did. Now let's talk about the other end, with the Warriors and their offensive game compared to the Bulls' defense. Of course, the Bulls in 96, again, were one of the best defensive teams in the league, and that 90s dynasty Bulls was an incredibly talented team on defense because of guys like Pippen, Rodman, and Ron Harper. And people also forget just how good of a defender Michael Jordan was. Like, the guy won Defensive Player of the Year and was a 9-time All-Defensive Team player. They were great at guarding the perimeter, which they would need to do in order to counter the Warriors' outside shooting. And they would need guys with great lateral quickness to keep up with the dribble drive penetration which the Bulls would have. The question is, how would the Bulls handle the Warriors' ability to spread the floor, especially with Klay Thompson as a catch-and-shoot sharpshooter while also needing to lock down Kevin Durant and Steph Curry? I mean, really, the Bulls are going to need Pippen and Rodman to focus and double up on Kevin Durant, while Harper and Jordan would need to provide the added help defense on Curry, which would leave Klay open on a lot of plays, which of course was what enabled the Warriors to be so successful at that time, because no matter how much you could lock down Kevin Durant and Curry and switch to double teaming each of them, you still had an incredible shooter in Klay Thompson that could space the floor and knock down threes. That's really the biggest gap for the Bulls on defense, is the sheer number of scorers the Warriors had in the starting lineup. But I want to go back to the Bulls offense because this is the biggest thing that separates them from the Warriors. And it's the triangle offense for which Phil Jackson liked to run, which teams of today would not be prepared to handle simply because it's not used anymore. Partially because teams aren't as effective in running it, and because the league has transitioned to a pace and space system of play anyway. But because the Bulls team in 96 was so effective at running the triangle centered around Michael Jordan, it would throw off the Warriors on how they would defend this offensive scheme and how to limit Jordan in the mid-range. And guys, more importantly, the Bulls have Michael Jordan, the ultimate competitor, a guy who never lost in the finals. He didn't bounce to a 73-win team that he couldn't beat like Kevin Durant did. He wasn't MIA like Steph Curry was in most of his finals appearances. Curry still doesn't have a single finals MVP award. Like, those are important factors even outside the general schematics of the game between offense and defense. On top of that, the Bulls had a deeper bench than the Warriors did with added scoring, particularly from Tony Kukoc. The Bulls would have a strong mid-range game, but at the same time outside shooting with Kerr, Bushler, and Kukoc, and even Jordan and Pippen, who were decent three-point shooters as well. And Phil Jackson was such a brilliant-minded coach. His ability to adjust and adapt rotations based on the opposing team's offense is what made his teams always so successful. Yes, it helped that he always had some of the best players in the game of basketball, but still, that being said, what made Phil Jackson so great was his ability to outcoach his opponent. So look, I'm not saying the Bulls would have dominated the 2017 Warriors and that it would have ended in a sweep blowing them out in each game. It would have been a very closely fought series. But the argument that the 90s basketball wasn't as strong and competitive as it is today, people underestimate just how competitive Michael Jordan was and his ability to adjust and adapt to different styles of play in a basketball game. Which, let's be honest, Jordan would be that much stronger on offense in today's game without all the new hand-checking rules and less physical style of play that we see now. So I think ultimately, the 96 Bulls would defeat the 2017 Warriors in a 7-game series, likely in 6 or 7 games. Like I said, it would still be close, but no way are the Warriors beating the Bulls in 6 games like Curry believes that they would. Of course, these are all complete hypotheticals, and we'll never know how these teams would have fared against each other, and I'm sure there will be a lot of comments in favor or against this analysis, which is completely fine because, again, it's near impossible to determine how a 7-game series would have transpired between two teams that obviously will never go against each other. If you're still here at the end of this video, though, you guys are the best. I put a lot of work into this one, so if you enjoyed it, please give a like on the video. And of course, as always, be sure to subscribe as I do post daily Bulls content. Thanks again for tuning in, guys, and I will catch you in the next one.